A black doctor, fresh off a 12-hour shift at the local finally heads to his car, ready to go home and rest. But before he can even leave the hospital parking lot, he's stopped by a security guard who questions his presence. The interaction quickly escalates, and despite showing his ID badge and calmly explaining, the guard calls the police, accusing him of trespassing. What happens next is caught on video, shocking the world and sparking a wave of outrage that no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story that needs to be told. Before we dive into it, share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories that shine a light on injustice. It was just supposed to be another ordinary night. The morning was crisp, the kind that hinted at an early spring but carried the memory of winter in its breeze. James Whitaker adjusted his tie in the reflection of the storefront window. His briefcase held tightly in one hand. The streets of Montgomery had begun to stir, shopkeepers raising their shutters, the occasional clatter of a passing trolley adding a rhythm to the waking city. James had always enjoyed the quiet moments of the morning, the way the world seemed to pause before the chaos of the day unraveled. Yet, today was different. Today, he was stepping into a new chapter as the first black director of a prominent local community center. A role many had whispered was too ambitious for someone of his background. The community center sat on the edge of a dividing line, an unspoken border where the city's racial tensions simmered. To the east lay the affluent neighborhoods, sprawling lawns and stately homes, mostly white. To the west, a tight-knit black community carved out resilience in the face of systemic neglect. The center was meant to bridge that divide, a noble goal, though James was under no illusions about the challenges ahead. As he reached the building, James noticed the sign hanging slightly askew above the double doors. Montgomery Community Initiative, it read. The letters were bold, the paint fresh, but it couldn't mask the subtle wear of the old frame it clung to. He adjusted the sign with care, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was a symbolic act, but one that steadied him as he stepped inside. The center smelled of varnish and potential. Rooms that had long been empty now buzzed with the promise of activity. After-school programs, job training sessions, even a small library in the back. James had spent weeks planning this day. But as he looked around, the enormity of the task began to weigh on him. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a throat clearing. Turning, he saw Mrs. Annie Mercer, a stalwart of the community, standing in the doorway. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her hands rested on the handle of a cane that looked more like a scepter. James Whitaker, she said, her voice a blend of warmth and steel. It's good to see someone with a backbone take charge around here. Lord knows this place needs it. James smiled, stepping forward to greet her. Mrs. Mercer, it's an honor. I hope to make you proud. She gave him a look that seemed to pierce straight through his resolve. Hope's a fine thing, Mr. Whitaker, but this isn't a place for hope alone. It's a place for action. And you'll need all of it. Before he could respond, the bell over the door jingled, and two young boys burst in, their faces alight with curiosity. They wore hand-me-down clothes that didn't quite fit, and their shoes carried the mud of streets that had never seen the benefit of proper drainage. Is this the place with the basketball court? One of them asked. His voice eager. James knelt to their level. It sure is. We're opening it up later this week. But if you stick around, I'll give you a sneak peek. The boys exchanged a glance, their excitement palpable. But before they could respond, another figure appeared in the doorway. A man in a sheriff's uniform. His presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. Sheriff Tom Delaney was a fixture of the town. His wide-brimmed hat and polished badge symbols of an authority that rarely felt just. Morning, Whitaker, Delaney drawled, his eyes scanning the room with practiced disinterest. Thought I'd stop by, see what you've got planned for this place. James stood, his posture firm. Good morning, Sheriff. We're looking to provide resources for the community. Things that'll benefit everyone. Delaney smirked, the corners of his mouth curling as if he found the very notion amusing. That's so? Just remember, there are rules to how things run around here. Wouldn't want you stepping on the wrong toes. The unspoken threat hung in the air, a heavy weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. James felt the heat of Mrs. Mercer's gaze, her silent expectation for him to stand his ground. I'm here to serve the community. Sheriff. James replied, his voice steady. And that means all of it. Delaney's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, measured stare. We'll see about that, he said, tipping his hat before turning on his heel and leaving. The door closed with a sharp clang. The silence that followed thick with tension. Mrs. Mercer broke it with a dry chuckle. Well, you've made your first impression, Mr. Whitaker. Let's see if it lasts. James exhaled, the weight of the encounter settling in his chest. The quiet of the morning was gone, replaced by the stark reality of the day ahead. He looked at the boys, who now stood a little closer together, their excitement tempered by uncertainty. Come on, James said, his tone lightening as he gestured toward the gym. Let me show you that basketball court. As the boys followed him, their steps hesitant but hopeful, James felt a spark reignite within him. The path forward was fraught, but he would walk it. For them, for Mrs. Mercer, and for everyone who believed that the lines dividing the city could one day be erased. The morning sunlight that had filled the community center with promise was soon replaced by the reality of its purpose. James spent the better part of the day meeting staff and volunteers, each one bringing their own hopes and apprehensions. There was Ellen, a retired teacher who had volunteered to run literacy programs, and Miguel, a local contractor helping to renovate the gym. Their faces, though welcoming, carried the stories of lives shaped by the city's unspoken rules. By midday, the air in the center had grown heavier, both from the southern heat and the underlying tensions that simmered beneath the surface. James found himself at a table in the common area, poring over the budget with Deborah, the center's administrative assistant. Deborah was sharp, with an eye for detail and a demeanor that brooked no nonsense. James, she said, her brow furrowed as she highlighted line after line of expenses. We're running on fumes here. The city's funding barely covers the basics, and the donations we've been getting aren't enough to bridge the gap. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We'll find a way, Deborah. We have to. This place is too important. Deborah gave him a knowing look. You're optimistic. I admire that, but optimism doesn't pay for heating in the winter. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices coming from the front entrance. James stood, the tension in the air snapping like a taut wire. As he approached the door, he saw two men locked in a heated argument. One was Charles, a young black father who had been a vocal advocate for the center. And the other was Hank, a white business owner from across town. You people think you can just waltz in here and take over? Hank's voice was loud, his words sharp with accusation. Charles stood firm, his hands clenched at his sides. This place is for everyone. If you can't see that, maybe you're part of the problem. James stepped between them, his presence cutting through the tension. Gentlemen, let's keep this civil, he said, his voice calm but firm. What seems to be the issue? Hank jabbed a finger in Charles's direction. The issue is, folks like him think they can run things without respecting the people who've been here for generations. Charles's eyes narrowed. And by folks like me, you mean what? Exactly? Say it, Hank. James raised a hand, his gaze moving between the two men. Enough. This isn't the place for that kind of talk. Hank, if you've got concerns, let's discuss them respectfully. Hank glared at James, his jaw tightening. You think this place is gonna change anything? You're just stirring the pot. Don't be surprised when it boils over. With that, he turned and stormed out, the door slamming shut behind him. Charles shook his head, his frustration evident. That's what we're up against. James, they don't want to see us succeed. James placed a hand on Charles's shoulder. We're going to face resistance. But we're not here to fight fire with fire. We're here to prove them wrong by building something better. Charles nodded, though the tension in his body didn't ease. I hope you're right. That afternoon, James received an unexpected call from Councilman Edgar Harper, one of the few city officials who had supported the center's reopening. Harper's tone was measured but laced with concern. James, he said, I've been hearing some rumblings. People aren't happy about the changes you're making. James sighed. With all due respect, Councilman, those people are the ones who've ignored this side of town for years. They don't want change because they don't want to lose control. I understand that, Harper replied, but you have to tread carefully. If you push too hard, you risk losing the support you already have. James tightened his grip on the receiver. Treading carefully hasn't worked for us in the past. This community deserves more than caution, it deserves action. Harper was silent for a moment before responding. Just be careful, James. You're walking a fine line. The day ended with a meeting in the library, where James addressed a small group of volunteers. He could see the weariness in their eyes. The way years of fighting for change had worn them down. Yet, they were here, ready to work. As he spoke, he chose his words carefully. I know this isn't easy. I know the odds are stacked against us. But this place, this center, is a chance to show what we're capable of. To prove that we're more than the stereotypes. More than the struggles they expect us to crumble under. The room was quiet as his words sank in. Finally, Mrs. Mercer, sitting in the back, nodded approvingly. You got the right words, Mr. Whitaker. Let's hope the world's ready to listen. But James knew that the world was rarely ready. Change wasn't something that arrived gently, it had to be fought for. Earned inch by inch, and as he locked up the center that night, the weight of that fight settled heavily on his shoulders. Stepping outside, he paused to look at the street. The dividing line between two worlds. The east side was bathed in the warm glow of streetlights, while the west side seemed to fade into shadow. The divide wasn't just physical. It was a chasm carved by years of inequity and prejudice. James straightened his tie, his resolve hardening. The fight was just beginning, and the lines drawn in silence would have to be confronted with voices that refused to be ignored. The following week began with a strained silence in the community. James could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact on the sidewalks. In the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room. The tension was no longer hidden. It had become a weight pressing down on the entire neighborhood. At the center, the unease took on different forms. The volunteers worked diligently, but the energy that had filled the building just days earlier had dimmed. Charles had taken to spending his breaks outside, his eyes scanning the street like he was waiting for a storm. Deborah, who usually greeted everyone with a sharp word and a sly smile, now spoke in clipped sentences, her focus unwavering but her warmth absent. That afternoon, as James sat in his office preparing for a meeting with local business owners, Deborah knocked on the door. "You've got a visitor," she said, her voice unusually flat, "and he doesn't seem happy." James looked up, his brow furrowing. "Who is it?" Deborah stepped aside, and a tall, broad-shouldered man entered the room. His face was lined with years of hard living, and his eyes held a familiar mix of skepticism and disdain. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, his tone curt, "I'm Carl Daniels. I own the hardware store down on Main." James stood and extended a hand, which Carl ignored. The air between them grew colder. "Mr. Daniels," James began, choosing his words carefully, "what can I do for you?" Carl crossed his arms, his stance as unyielding as his expression. "You can start by explaining what you're doing to this town. Ever since you reopened this place, things have been different, and not in a good way." James held Carl's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "This center is here to help the community, Mr. Daniels, to give people opportunities they've been denied for too long." Carl scoffed. "Opportunities? All I see is you stirring up trouble. People like me, who've been here for generations. We're the ones who built this town. And now you want to come in and rewrite the rules?" James stepped around his desk, closing the distance between them. "No one's rewriting the rules, Carl. But maybe it's time we questioned why the rules were written the way they were." Carl's face darkened. "Careful, Mr. Whitaker. You might not like where that line of questioning leads." The words hung in the air like a warning. Deborah, standing in the doorway, cleared her throat. "That's enough, Carl," she said, her voice sharp. "You've said your piece. Now let James get back to work." Carl glanced at Deborah, his expression softening slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "Just remember," he said, turning back to James, "this town doesn't take kindly to outsiders who overstep." As Carl left, Deborah stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "You okay?" she asked. James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm fine, but it's clear that not everyone sees this place as progress." Deborah smirked, though there was little humor in it. "That's putting it lightly. Carl's got a lot of influence around here. If he's against us, it's going to make things harder." James nodded, his mind already racing. "Then we'll just have to work harder." Later that evening, James attended a town hall meeting held at the library. The room was packed, a sea of faces both familiar and unfamiliar. He took a seat near the front, aware of the murmurs that followed him. Councilman Harper stood at the podium, attempting to maintain order as voices rose in frustration. "This isn't about race," one woman said, her voice tight with anger. "It's about tradition. Our town has always had certain values. And now it feels like those are being thrown out the window." "And what values are those?" a younger man countered from the back. "The ones that kept the east side underfunded while the west side thrived?" The room erupted in shouts. The lines of division as clear as the streets that separated the neighborhoods. Harper banged his gavel, his voice rising above the din. "Enough," he shouted. "We're here to discuss the future of our town, not rehash old arguments." James stood, his presence commanding the room's attention. "If we're discussing the future," he said, his voice steady but firm, "then we can't ignore the past. This town has been divided for too long, and pretending otherwise won't solve anything." Someone in the back muttered, "Here we go again." But James pressed on. "The community center isn't a threat," he continued. "It's a resource, a chance to bridge the gaps that have kept us apart. But we can't do that if we're too busy pointing fingers to extend a hand." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, James allowed himself to hope. But as he scanned the faces before him, he saw the resistance etched into too many of them. That night, as James walked home, he noticed a group of young boys playing basketball under a dim streetlight. The court's cracked pavement and rusted hoop spoke volumes about the neglect the neighborhood had endured. Yet, their laughter cut through the night, a defiant reminder of the resilience that lived here. He stopped to watch, a faint smile tugging at his lips. But his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires screeching. A car sped past, its occupants shouting something indistinct but unmistakably hostile. The words lingered in the air like smoke, a bitter reminder of the battles still to come. James turned back to the boys, their game unaffected by the fleeting ugliness. He straightened his posture, the faint smile returning. The road ahead was treacherous, but he wouldn't let fear dictate his steps. For every shadow cast by prejudice, there was a light waiting to shine, and James was determined to keep walking until the light outshone the darkness. By the time the first frost settled over the town, the divide between progress and resistance had grown wider. James felt it in the way conversations stiffened when he entered the room. In the way neighbors who once waved now averted their gaze. The battle lines had been drawn, not with flags or banners but with whispered accusations and subtle acts of defiance. One morning, as James arrived at the community center, he noticed something that made his heart sink. Spray painted across the brick facade were the words, "Know your place," in bold, jagged letters. The message was unmistakable. James stood there, his breath visible in the cold air, and let the weight of the words settle over him. A few volunteers gathered behind him, their murmurs filled with outrage and fear. Deborah was the first to speak. "We need to call the police." James nodded but kept his eyes on the graffiti. "We will, but this isn't just about cleaning walls. It's about cleaning minds." Charles, standing nearby, folded his arms across his chest. "That's easier said than done, James. People don't change overnight." "No," James replied, turning to face them, "but we can't let this stop us. This center is more than just a building. It's a symbol, and symbols are powerful, especially to those who feel threatened by them." That afternoon, James attended a meeting with local school administrators, hoping to expand the center's tutoring program. The principal of Westside Elementary, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Klein, welcomed him into her office with a smile that felt too tight to be genuine. "We appreciate what you're doing, Mr. Whitaker," she began, her tone polite but clipped. "But I have to be honest. Some parents are concerned." "Concerned about what?" James asked, his voice calm but firm. Mrs. Klein hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with a pen. "They feel the program might bring a certain element into the school." James tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And by certain element, you mean children from the East Side?" Mrs. Klein's cheeks flushed. "It's not about race," she said quickly. "It's about maintaining the school's culture. Some parents worry that the new students might not integrate well." James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Mrs. Klein, education isn't about culture or integration. It's about opportunity. And every child in this town deserves that, no matter which side of the tracks they come from." Mrs. Klein looked away, her discomfort palpable. "I'll bring it up at the next board meeting," she said, her voice faint, "but I can't promise anything." James stood, his resolve unwavering. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for fairness." As he left the school, James couldn't help but feel the sting of her words. They weren't overtly racist, but the subtext was clear: progress was welcome, so long as it didn't challenge the status quo. That evening, James received a call from Deborah. Her voice was tense. "You need to get down here." When he arrived at the center, a crowd had gathered outside. At the center of the commotion was Carl Daniels, the hardware store owner, flanked by a few other men from the town. They were carrying signs with slogans like, "Keep our town ours," and "No outsiders allowed." James approached the group, his presence commanding enough to quiet the crowd. "What's going on here, Carl?" Carl stepped forward, his voice loud and full of bravado. "We're exercising our right to protest. This town doesn't need your kind stirring things up." "My kind?" James asked, his tone deceptively calm. "And what kind is that, exactly?" Carl smirked, his confidence bolstered by the murmurs of agreement around him. "The kind that doesn't belong. You come in here with your big ideas and your big words, trying to tell us how to live, but we don't need you." James took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Carl, this center is for everyone. It's not about division, it's about connection." Carl jabbed a finger in James's direction. "Connection? Don't make me laugh. You're not building connections. You're building walls." The crowd erupted in applause, their anger feeding off Carl's words. James raised his hands, calling for calm. "Let me ask you this, Carl," James said, his voice cutting through the noise. "What are you so afraid of? That things might change? That the people you've ignored for decades might finally have a voice?" Carl's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "I'm not afraid of anything," he said. "I'm just standing up for what's right." "And what's right," James countered, "is making sure every person in this town has the chance to succeed. If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time to ask yourself why." For a moment, silence fell over the crowd. James could see the cracks in their resolve, the flickers of doubt, but the moment passed, and Carl turned away with a dismissive wave. "Come on," he said to the group. "Let's get out of here." As they dispersed, James stood there, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and determination. Deborah came to stand beside him, her expression wary but supportive. "That was brave," she said. James shook his head. "It wasn't bravery. It was a necessity." Later that night, as James walked home, he noticed a light on in the small church at the edge of the neighborhood. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The space was quiet, the air thick with the scent of old wood and candle wax. At the altar, Pastor Reed stood, his head bowed in prayer. James approached, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The pastor looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face. "James," he said, "what brings you here?" James hesitated, then said, "I needed a place to think." Pastor Reed gestured for him to sit, and together they settled into a pew near the front. "It's hard, isn't it?" the pastor said, his voice gentle, "fighting a battle no one wants to admit exists." James nodded, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the day. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. If people can really change." The pastor placed a hand on James's shoulder. "Change is never easy, and it's rarely quick, but it starts with people like you. People who are willing to shine a light in the darkness." James looked up at the cross above the altar, its simplicity both comforting and humbling. "What if the light isn't enough?" The pastor's grip tightened, his voice steady. "Then you hold it higher." As James left the church, the words stayed with him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't stop walking it, no matter how dark it got. The town's simmering tensions began to bubble over in ways James couldn't ignore. It started subtly, as these things often did: a sideways glance at the market, a conversation that hushed when he walked into a room. But soon, the hostility found bolder expressions: slashed tires on the community center's van, hateful notes left under doors, and, finally, a broken window at the center itself. James arrived at the scene just after dawn, the shards of glass glittering on the pavement like cruel little stars. The air was cold and still, the silence more oppressive than the vandalism itself. He stared at the jagged edges of the window, feeling the weight of every crack as though they were etched into his own spirit. Deborah was already there, broom in hand, her jaw set in grim determination. "This was deliberate," she said without looking up. "And it won't stop here." James nodded, stepping carefully over the glass. It's fear, Deborah. Fear wearing the mask of anger. Fear doesn't make it hurt any less, she replied, her voice clipped, or make it any easier to fix. That afternoon, James met with the mayor, a polished man named Robert Hensley whose charm was as practiced as his handshake. They sat in the mayor's grand office, a room filled with books no one had read and trophies no one remembered winning. James wasted no time. The community center has been targeted, and it's escalating. We need more than a statement. Robert, we need action. Mayor Hensley leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. I understand your concern, James, but you have to consider the bigger picture. If we respond too strongly, we risk alienating parts of the community. James leaned forward, his eyes sharp. And what about the parts of the community already alienated? The ones who don't have the luxury of being listened to unless someone like me forces the issue? The mayor's smile faltered, replaced by a carefully neutral expression. I'll look into it, he said, his tone non-committal. But these things take time. Time, James repeated, his voice low and steady. Tell that to the kid who has to walk past hateful graffiti on their way to school. Or the woman who feels unsafe in her own neighborhood. The mayor's gaze shifted, his discomfort clear. I'll see what I can do. James stood, his movements deliberate. Do more than see, Robert. Act. That evening, James attended a town hall meeting, the first since the vandalism. The room was packed, the air heavy with tension. As James stepped to the podium, he felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him. Some curious, some resentful, others hopeful. Good evening, he began, his voice steady despite the murmurs rippling through the crowd. I stand before you not as an outsider, but as a part of this community. A community I believe in, even when it's difficult to do so. Someone in the back scoffed, the sound cutting through the room like a knife. James paused, letting the silence stretch before continuing. I know there are those who think the changes we're pushing for are unnecessary. Or worse, harmful. But let me ask you this. What kind of harm are we afraid of? The harm of a child dreaming bigger than their circumstances? The harm of a neighbor feeling like they finally belong? A voice called out, sharp and mocking. Maybe we just don't want your kind telling us what to do. James turned toward the voice, his expression calm but unyielding. And what kind is that? The kind that believes every person deserves dignity? The kind that refuses to settle for less than equality? The room buzzed with whispers, the tension crackling like static. James let out a slow breath, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. I'm not here to fight you, he said, his voice softer but no less firm. I'm here to fight for us. All of us. Because whether we like it or not, our fates are tied together. And the sooner we realize that, the stronger we'll be. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on the crowd. For a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of understanding in a few faces. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the hard lines of resistance. That night, James walked home under a moonlit sky, his thoughts heavy. The streets were quiet, but the silence felt uneasy, like the calm before a storm. As he rounded the corner to his house, he noticed a figure leaning against his porch railing. It was Carl Daniels, the hardware store owner who had led the protest outside the community center. His posture was casual, but there was a tension in his stance that put James on edge. Evening, Carl, James said, keeping his voice neutral. Something I can help you with? Carl straightened, his face shadowed in the dim light. I came to talk, he said, his tone unreadable. James gestured toward the porch steps. Then let's talk. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Carl broke the silence. You think you're better than us, he said, his voice low. You come in here with your big ideas and your big words. And you act like you know what's best for this town. James met his gaze, unflinching. I don't think I'm better than anyone, Carl, but I do think we can be better together. Carl scoffed, looking away. You don't get it. This town doesn't need saving. It needs to stay the way it is. James leaned forward, his voice steady. The way it is? Where some people are left out while others hold all the power. Where fear is used to keep things comfortable for a few at the expense of many. Carl's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. James sighed, the weariness in his voice unmistakable. I'm not your enemy, Carl. The world is changing, whether we like it or not. The question isn't if, it's how. And I'd rather face that change together than apart. Carl stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. You can say all the pretty words you want, James, but some of us aren't buying it. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing into the night. James watched him go, a mix of frustration and resolve settling in his chest. The road ahead was steep, and the shadows were long. But James knew one thing for certain, he wouldn't stop climbing. Not now, not ever. The town awoke to the sound of sirens. Overnight, an explosion had rocked the small community center, leaving behind a gaping hole and a cloud of fear. No one was injured, by some miracle. The building had been empty. But the message was clear. Someone wanted to silence the progress James and his allies had fought for. James stood at the edge of the wreckage, his face grim as smoke curled into the dawn sky. Deborah arrived moments later, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in the scene. They've gone too far, she said, her voice trembling. This isn't vandalism anymore, this is war. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains. A war we didn't choose, he said quietly, but one we can't walk away from. The sheriff, an older man named Ben Turner, arrived shortly after. He approached James with a weary expression, the weight of his badge evident in his slumped shoulders. James, he began, his tone cautious, I know you're angry. Hell, we all are, but we need to let the investigation run its course. James turned to him, his eyes sharp. An investigation won't rebuild what's been lost, Ben, and it won't fix the rot that made this happen. Ben sighed, pulling his hat off and running a hand through his thinning hair. You're not wrong, but if we go about this the wrong way, it'll only make things worse. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. How much worse can it get? Ben, people are already scared to speak up. Scared to be seen standing with us. This, he gestured toward the ruins, is what happens when fear wins. Ben's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I'll do what I can, he said finally, though the doubt in his voice betrayed him. Word of the explosion spread quickly, and by noon, a crowd had gathered near the wreckage. Some came to offer support, while others arrived to fan the flames of division. Tensions crackled in the air like a storm waiting to break. James stood before the crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs. What happened here is not just an attack on a building, he said, his tone steady but fierce. It's an attack on hope, on unity, on everything we're trying to build. A man in the crowd shouted back, his voice thick with anger. Maybe you're the one bringing this trouble on us. Things were fine before you started stirring the pot. James paused, letting the words hang in the air. Fine for whom? He asked, his voice calm but unyielding. For those who never had to worry about their voices being silenced. For those who never had to fight just to be seen. The crowd shifted uneasily, some nodding in agreement while others crossed their arms in defiance. James scanned their faces, searching for a spark of understanding. I didn't come here to make enemies, he continued. I came here because I believe in this town. Because I believe we're better than this. But belief isn't enough. We have to act. That evening, James met with his closest allies at Deborah's home. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of the day pressing down on them. We need to push forward, James said, breaking the stillness. We can't let fear dictate our actions. How? Deborah asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. How do we keep fighting when they're willing to go this far? James looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze, by being louder than their hate, by showing them that no matter what they throw at us, we won't back down. A young man named Marcus, who had joined the movement after facing his own share of discrimination, spoke up. What if it gets worse? James? What if next time, someone doesn't walk away? James's jaw tightened. He had no easy answers. Then we'll grieve, Marcus, and then we'll keep going. Because if we stop, if we give in, they win, and I refuse to let them win. As the days passed, the investigation into the explosion yielded little progress. Frustration grew, both among James's supporters and the wider community. Whispers of suspicion and blame spread like wildfire, threatening to divide the town further. At the same time, a coalition of neighbors began to rally behind James, their determination fueled by the destruction. They organized fundraisers, held candlelight vigils, and started rebuilding the community center. Brick by brick, hope by fragile hope. One evening, James found himself at the construction site, laying mortar alongside Marcus. The younger man worked in silence, his movements sharp and purposeful. "You're angry," James said, not unkindly. Marcus glanced at him, his expression hard. "Aren't you?" "Every day," James admitted, "but anger can burn you out if you're not careful." Marcus paused, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "So what do we do with it?" James placed a hand on the unfinished wall, his voice quiet but firm. "We use it to build, to push forward, to prove them wrong." The turning point came during the town council meeting, where the explosion and its aftermath dominated the agenda. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. James sat in the front row, his presence a silent challenge to the council members. As the meeting dragged on, it became clear that some members were more concerned with preserving their reputations than addressing the deeper issues at play. Frustration boiled over, and James finally stood. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "We can't keep dancing around the truth. This isn't just about a building. It's about who we are as a community. And right now, we're failing." A murmur ran through the crowd. But James pressed on. "We have a choice to make. Do we stand together, or do we let fear tear us apart? Because make no mistake, what happened at the community center is just the beginning if we don't act." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. For the first time, James saw cracks in the council's facade. Faces softened, postures relaxed, and the hard lines of resistance began to blur. That night, James walked home under a sky full of stars, the crisp air carrying a hint of possibility. The road ahead was still steep, and the shadows were still long. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of something powerful. A quiet, unyielding hope. The morning brought the first frost of the season, a fragile sheen that coated the windows and sidewalks of the small town. James stood in his living room, staring out at the pale light filtering through the icy glass. He'd spent another sleepless night wrestling with the weight of the struggle. The hopes he carried, the lives he wanted to protect, and the opposition that seemed determined to shatter it all. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. It was Deborah, bundled in a heavy coat, her breath visible in the cold air. Her expression was tight with urgency. "You need to come with me," she said without preamble. James grabbed his coat and followed her outside. "What's happened?" "It's Marcus," Deborah said, her voice trembling. "There was an incident at the diner this morning." The diner was packed when they arrived, the usual hum of morning conversation replaced by tense whispers. At the center of the room, Marcus sat at a booth, his face bruised and his knuckles raw. Across from him sat Sheriff Turner, his notebook open, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" James asked, his voice sharp with concern. Marcus glanced up, his eyes blazing with a mix of anger and defiance. "They cornered me," he said. "A group of them called me every name in the book. When I tried to leave, one of them shoved me. I fought back." James's chest tightened. "Who was it?" Marcus gestured toward a cluster of men standing near the counter, their smug expressions daring anyone to challenge them. They were older, their faces weathered by years of labor, but their posture radiated a dangerous kind of confidence, the kind that came from knowing the system often worked in their favor. "I don't want any trouble," Marcus added, his voice low, "but I'm not going to let them treat me like I don't belong here." James turned to Sheriff Turner, his jaw tight. "What are you going to do about this?" Turner sighed, closing his notebook. "I'll talk to them," he said, "but you know how this goes, James. It's their word against his." "That's not good enough," James snapped. "If you let this slide, you're sending a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable." Turner's gaze flickered with something like regret, but he stood firm. "I'll do what I can, but I have to follow the law." James leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "And what happens when the law is the problem, Ben? What happens when the people meant to uphold it are the ones abusing it?" Turner didn't answer. He simply nodded at Marcus and walked away, leaving the tension in the room to hang like a storm cloud. Back at Deborah's house, the group gathered to discuss what had happened. Marcus sat with an ice pack pressed to his cheek, his frustration evident in every movement. "They don't want us here," he said finally. "No matter what we do, they'll find a way to push us out." James shook his head. "That's exactly what they want you to believe. But this is our town, too, and we have just as much right to be here as they do." Deborah leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "But how do we change their minds, James?" How do we make them see us as equals when they're so determined to keep us in our place? James took a deep breath, the weight of the question settling heavily on his shoulders. We can't force them to see us, he said, but we can make it impossible for them to ignore us. Over the next week, the group began organizing a march through the heart of the town. It wasn't just about responding to what had happened to Marcus. It was about showing the town that they refused to be silenced. The planning wasn't without its challenges. Some members of the community warned them against it, fearing it would only escalate tensions. Others outright opposed it, accusing James of stirring up trouble. One evening, James received a call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was low and menacing. "Call off the march," the caller said. "You're playing with fire." James hung up without responding, his hands shaking as he set the phone down. He'd faced threats before, but they never stopped being unsettling. Deborah found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkened street. She didn't need to ask what was wrong. "You don't have to do this alone. You know," she said, sitting beside him. "We're all in this together." James gave her a faint smile, though his eyes remained distant. "Sometimes it feels like the whole world is against us." "Maybe it is," Deborah said, her voice steady, "but that doesn't mean we stop fighting." The day of the march arrived, gray clouds hanging low over the town. People began gathering in the park where it would start, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. James stood at the front, flanked by Marcus and Deborah. As they began to march, the atmosphere was tense. Some onlookers watched in silence, while others jeered from the sidewalks. Police officers lined the route, their presence both a reassurance and a reminder of the stakes. When they reached the town square, James stepped forward to speak. His voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, steady and resolute. "We're here because we believe in this town," he said, "because we believe it can be better. But belief alone isn't enough. We have to act. We have to stand together. Even when it's hard. Even when it's dangerous." The crowd was silent, but James could see the flicker of something in their eyes. Hope, maybe, or the beginnings of understanding. As the march dispersed, James felt a cautious optimism. They had taken a step, however small, toward something better, but he knew the road ahead was still long, and the challenges would only grow. That night, as he sat by the fire in his small living room, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. The cracks in the mirror were growing, and through them, he could see the glimmers of change. The march had left the town humming with unease. In the days that followed, the air seemed charged, like the moments before a summer storm. Conversations were sharp and hushed. Glances were wary and lingering. For James, the weight of it all was ever present, but he had grown used to carrying burdens that didn't belong solely to him. One evening, as James was locking up the community center, Deborah came rushing in, her face pale. "They've gone after Marcus again," she said, her voice trembling. The scene at Marcus's modest home was chaotic. His front yard was littered with shattered glass. Graffiti scrawled across the front of the house in thick red letters, "Leave." A burning cross, now extinguished, lay in the driveway, its smoke still hanging in the cool evening air. Marcus stood by his door, his hands trembling as he stared at the wreckage. Neighbors had gathered, whispering among themselves, their faces etched with fear and concern. The sheriff's car sat idly by the curb, its lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. James approached Marcus cautiously. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Marcus shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "Not physically," he said, his voice low and raw. "But how many times can a man's spirit take a beating before it gives out?" James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We're going to fight this." Marcus turned to him, his eyes hollow. "Fight how? With words? With marches? These people don't care about words, James. They want to break us." Later that night, James sat alone in his small living room, the weight of Marcus's words heavy on his heart. The march had been a bold step, but the retaliation it had sparked felt like a blow against their progress. He thought about the stories his father had told him of the Deep South, of nights spent hiding while the same symbols of hate burned in fields and front yards. He thought they had moved past that the struggle had evolved, but the embers of old hatred had never truly gone out. The phone rang, breaking his reverie. It was Deborah. "James," she said, her voice urgent, "there's a town hall meeting tomorrow. They're calling it to address recent events. You know what that means. James sighed, his grip tightening on the receiver. They're going to blame us. They'll try, Deborah said, but we can't let them. You have to speak. The town hall was packed. Every seat in the small, stuffy room was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The atmosphere crackled with tension. On one side, members of James's community sat together, their faces a mixture of defiance and fear. On the other, longtime residents of the town sat stiffly, their expressions guarded. The mayor, a gray-haired man with a voice that commanded attention, opened the meeting with a solemn tone. We're here to discuss the troubling incidents that have unfolded in our town. He began, and how we can move forward as a community. James could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. He knew what they were expecting. Defensiveness, accusations, or perhaps silence. But he had spent a lifetime learning how to wield his voice like a blade. When the mayor opened the floor for comments, James rose to speak. My name is James Carter. He began, his voice steady but firm. I've lived in this town for over 30 years. I've watched it grow and change. And I've seen the best and worst it has to offer. Tonight, I'm here to talk about what it means to live in a place where you're seen as less than human. Murmurs rippled through the room. But James pressed on. When my friend Marcus's home was attacked, it wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on all of us who dare to exist in a space some believe we don't belong. It was a message, one written in hatred and fear. He scanned the room, his gaze meeting the mayor's before moving to Sheriff Turner. I hear a lot about unity and community. But unity doesn't come from silence. It doesn't come from sweeping problems under the rug. It comes from confronting the ugliness in our midst and doing the hard work of change. The room was deathly silent now. Even those who had crossed their arms in defiance seemed unable to look away. I am not here to ask for permission to live, James said, his voice rising. I am not here to beg for acceptance. I am here to demand accountability. To demand that we all look in the mirror and ask ourselves what kind of town we want this to be. After James sat down, the mayor called for order. His own discomfort evident. Several people spoke after him. Some in support, others in opposition, but the tide had shifted. James's words hung in the air, unshakable. When the meeting adjourned, Deborah found James outside, sitting on the steps of the town hall. She handed him a coffee and sat beside him. That was something, she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. James nodded, staring out into the cold night. Words are powerful, he said, but they're not enough. No, Deborah agreed, but they're a start. The days that followed were a blur of action. Community members banded together to help Marcus repair his home. Funds were raised, letters were written, and meetings were held. The attacks didn't stop entirely. But each act of hate was met with an equal or greater act of resilience. One evening, as James walked home from the community center, he noticed something new. In one of the shop windows downtown, where once there had been only silence, now hung a sign. Hate has no home here. James paused, his heart heavy with the knowledge of how far they still had to go. But lightened by the faint glimmer of progress. It wasn't the end. James knew that the fight for equality was never truly over. But as he stood in the twilight, watching the world around him shift, he allowed himself a moment of hope. For every step backward, there were two forwards, and though the path was steep and treacherous, it was a path worth walking. Because in the end, it wasn't just about him, or Marcus, or even their small town. It was about a world where everyone could stand tall, their humanity unquestioned, their dignity intact, and James would keep walking that path, no matter how long it took.